and welcome. Welcome to the 8th in the series, Considerations and Strategies for Running Clinical Trials During the COVID-19 Pandemic. My name is Shani Dyer and I'm the CEO of HREC. So the topic today is HREC and Governance Part 2. We heard in Part 1 from Kylie Sproston, Cam Ewan and James Cocaine just only a month ago, but it seems forever ago. So this is part 2. If anybody's on the line who's not muted in the panel, could you mute me? So that's the topic for today. But first, we're going to hear from Suzanne Hasthorpe, who's the Manager Coordinating Office for Clinical Trial Research at Victoria Health, who, due to technical issues, couldn't present last week, and I wanted to ensure we got the messages out from all states in relation to the next steps in the pandemic. After this, we'll hear from Helen Hughes, who's a Senior Health Researcher at the Child and Adolescent Health Service in WA, Lisa Eckstein, Senior Lecturer in Law, the University of Tasmania, and Chair of the Tasmanian Health and Medical Human Research Ethics Committee. And finally, Sonia Hancock, who's the Manager, Research Integrity and Compliance at Metro South Health Queensland. So great panel for today. Ethics committees have played a vital role during the COVID-19 pandemic. And, you know, as we've all struggled with issues of managing our trials, our patients, our sponsors during this time, ensuring that the work that we've done already and the work that we are doing, the patients that we've enrolled and the data we've collected is valued and remains so. And ethics committees play a really important role in this. So it's important we stay in touch and our studies are managed and reported appropriately. Our speakers today will share their insights and updates. As we know, we'll be dealing with this new normal for some time to come. So if we move on to the next slide, Joe, look, very much big thanks to MTP Connect and New South Wales Health, who've come on board to sponsor this series and made it possible to deliver this for you. Next slide. The volunteer program. Now, if you've registered for the program, I want to just say a really big thank you. It was such an amazing outcome with so many people putting their hands up. So really, truly amazing, thank you. And we thank Queensland Health for spearheading this program and New South Wales Health for supporting it as well. On our next slide, we're really excited. If you're not aware, this week on the 20th, it's International Clinical Trials Day. And we have Professor Ian Chubb speaking in the afternoon. Professor Chubb is best known to us as the recently passed Australian Chief Scientist, but he has also more recently been a clinical trial patient. He has a fascinating story to tell, and I think he's going to be a great advocate for clinical trials in the future. So next slide, technology. If the event is going to be recorded, so amazing number of people have been accessing the recording, so that's fantastic. We'll have the questions at the end, so please put your questions in as you think of them so that we will get to them at the end for you to get answers. Next slide, Joe. So again, I just reiterate, you know, we're a source of knowledge, but please go to health.gov.au for further information and updates. Next slide, Joe. Again, we're up to part 8. I don't know what we're going to do after part 10, but let's just see what people think, what people need. Okay, and again, the next slide, Joe, who is HREC, for those who don't know us, we've been around for quite a long time to provide a voice and to provide career path and education for people in the clinical research, regulatory, health economics, etc. sectors. And I think during this time of COVID, been providing, I think, an important role in communication, information sharing, and really getting to the nub of, you know, what the key issues are that you're all facing. And with that, I'll go to the next slide to say, introduce more properly our speakers for today's session. As I said, we have Suzanne first talking about what's happening into the future, followed by Helen, Lisa and Sonia. So with that, I'll go to the next slide and I'll hand over to Suzanne, who's prepared slides for you and will present. Thank you, Suzanne.
Thanks very much, Shani. Thank you for the introduction and for being able to provide an update for Victoria today. Could I have the second slide, please, Joe? The COVID-19 response has largely been led by the Australian governments, both in the health and the economic environments, to protect the individuals and minimise adverse outcomes to everyone. The public health system, though, has been at the centre of health response, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. This has been focused on emergency management and deployment of resources, and also for the workforce to be prepared for the pandemic, and especially so in the research sector. The next slide, please. So in the public health system, the COVID response has a number of aspects. There's been new research and trials that emerged very quickly on COVID-19 to maximise improvement in treatments, repurposing known drugs and vaccines for trials, devices, investigating broad health aspects, and also registries and other data collection. At health services, there have been existing trials, of course, and research, and these in many cases have been paused and will be continued with informed decision making and consideration of participants and their ongoing care in some cases. Sponsors have also paused their existing trials, but some also have been continued depending on considerations of the participants and their ongoing care. New trials may be progressing to activation, which are non-COVID, so that these will be ready to start when the COVID restrictions, etc., die down a bit. Then also we found that new feasibilities are active in readiness for commencement of the recovery phase. The next slide, please, Joe. We've looked at some of the data that's come into the ethics application area of our Ethics Review Manager system, which is an online application and administration system for ethics and site-specific assessment research governance. And this is going by month, the submissions to ethics, some being full ethics applications, some being low and negligible risk. If we look at the top line, it's medical research, and you can see there in the first 4 months of 2019 compared to the first 4 months of 2020, it's quite similar activity. In the clinical trials area, again, the activity is not remarkably different, but you will see in February, March and April, the number of actual trials has decreased. Disregard May because we haven't got all the data for May. The next slide, please. Now, many people have talked about there's been a great number of amendments occurred during this time as well. And if we look at January to April 2019 compared to January to April 2020, you can see that in 2020 there is a steep upward trend for more amendments coming into ethics, and it well above what we normally would expect over the 12 months. The next slide, please, Joe. In the recovery phase, we've been looking at what lessons we've learned and then trying to decide where we go from here. Now, the first one, which is probably most remarkable, is teletrials. These have been implemented in the COVID-19 response for participants in trials occurring in other jurisdictions. And Victoria has been involved with getting teletrials into, for instance, Tasmania. And that has solved the closed border restrictions where participants could no longer travel for their trial visits to another state or territory. So in the future, it's really going to be something that should increase use of teletrials to access clinical trials in especially the rural, regional and remote communities, and cross-border trial opportunities where, even though we may have the borders open, participants might not be that well and they may not want to travel long distances. In the next slide, please. The other area is e-signatures, and these are available and utilised in IT systems for ethics and site-specific assessments. We have the Ethics Review Manager system, and it comes with a full capability of e-signatures for all applications and also reporting applications. And this has worked out very well for the remote working situation without any process interruption. The where to next, we really need to embed e-signature uptake a little more than we have had in the past. And we have training and guidance for researchers in place. And there's a reference there in this slide to a link for quick tips on using e-signatures in the Victorian Ethics Review Manager system. The next slide, please, Joe. The other one is remote monitoring for trials that are commercially sponsored. This has been a great topic of discussion. And at the moment, there are restrictions on entering health services, and this is because of the COVID-19, and this disrupted monitors' access to the relevant documents that they might want to view for their trial monitoring. Also, there have been travel restrictions, border closures and air travel disruptions, so it has not been easy for monitors to make their usual visits. In future though, we need to develop standards and guidance for remote monitoring because it's not uniformly adopted in Victoria at this time, but it is developing. We need, I think, government leadership on this, and also the other considerations is to have upfront consent for remote monitoring and site governance requirements. The other thing is that we are now going to look at scoping the impact on health services and their available technologies so that we might be able to have more health services providing remote monitoring facilities under safe and privacy considerations that are necessary in using remote monitoring. The last slide, thanks, Joe. This is just a couple of links for you. We have a streamlined e-bulletin we put out regularly as required, and this has a lot of updates on the new things that we have to provide to people and other aspects of interest. So if you'd like to join the e-bulletin mail out list, please register through the email address there. Okay, thanks very much, Joe.
Great, thanks Suzanne. That was a really great and concise update, touching on all the very pointy issues. So fantastic, thanks for that. So look, going then to the programmed presentation, we have our first panelist, Helen Hughes, who is a senior health researcher at the Child and Adolescent Health Services in Western Australia, and she's going to give us an update. Thank you, Helen.
Thanks, Sue. Thanks for the opportunity to present from the perspective of our health service, which is the Child and Adolescent Health Service. Our health service incorporates Perth Children's Hospital, as well as community health and child and adolescent mental health. And my role here is actually in research ethics and compliance, not as a senior health researcher. That's an update recently. And the research that we review and that occurs on site can be pharmaceutical company-sponsored trials or investigator-initiated projects that are run by CARS clinicians. as well as projects that are run by our colleagues across collaborating institutions such as Telethon Kids Institute and a number of universities and institutions across Australia. Next slide, thanks, Jay. So as we've heard from Suzanne, the impact of COVID-19 on ongoing research can be quite extensive. There are many things that we need to consider, and the primary risks, of course, are to the safety of the research participants and the integrity of the research data when there's an external health crisis happening. But there are additional aspects that we need to consider, including the risks to staff of maintaining face-to-face research visits, the risks of being present in a hospital environment as a healthy research participant volunteer, access to usual hospital areas such as research clinic rooms, and a decrease in elective surgery where we have very active research at CARS, as well as participants that may be choosing not to continue their research participation and remote work arrangements for researchers that are no longer on site. Next slide, thanks. So the approach that we took was aligned with the NHMRC recommendations, but at the most fundamental level, we referred back to the National Statement on Ethical Conduct in Human Research and Good Clinical Practice for guidance. So these guidance documents allow for researchers to implement any required deviation or amendment to the protocol to manage an immediate safety risk to participants. A qualified physician in consultation with the sponsor should be making this decision, and this was extrapolated at CARS to include any potential risks to staff that would be conducting those appointments. It was our view, and according to good clinical practice, it's the PI and the CPI that's best placed to make these decisions, and then to communicate with the Ethics Committee or the Governance Office as required. We're fortunate that we have a delegated review process with members of our review panels and Ethics Committee available to review issues within 24 to 48 hours. So this has allowed us for minor notifications as well as for expedited review of amendments for safety reasons to be turned around very quickly. The most frequent changes that we had were pauses to recruitment and the use of remote visits or contacts wherever possible. Next slide. Thanks, Jo. So our advice was always to refer researchers back to the sponsor of the project to ensure that there was a consistent approach across all sites. We advise that research teams should clearly know who the decision maker in their team is and how to contact them and what the backup plan is, and of course where they will be documenting decisions in relation to their ongoing research. This should always be available in the master file. There are a number of ongoing projects that have submitted amendments to capture data about the impact of COVID-19, and we've had 5 projects that have specifically been looking at aspects of COVID-19, either on presentations to our health service or the impact on the exposure of staff, as well as projects looking at asymptomatic carriage in children. Understandably, all this has increased the workload on our office and required the expedited review processes on behalf of research ethics and governance. We're very fortunate with our team that we've got a number of research support positions that have worked closely with the investigators to ensure that they're fully prepared with their ethics submission, which has enabled a quicker turnaround from an administrative perspective, but it's also been able to ensure that any ethical considerations have been appropriately preempted and fully addressed in the initial application, allowing the application to progress to approval as quickly as possible. Next slide, thanks. So we had a meeting in March with all the research teams, and that they're all invited to discuss the evolving situation, and we talked about things that they should consider in relation to their research. These things included consideration of the temporary halt to recruitment, any requirements for on-site visits at the hospital, or whether things could be done via telehealth or phone contact, particularly to continue the remote safety monitoring of participants. We asked them to think about how participants would be contacting the study team, particularly if there were minimal staff on site or people were working remotely. We asked them to consider training additional people in the protocol or in specific study tasks if people would be taking leave, or if the study teams would be split with some on site and some working from home. And we asked them to consider the impact of their research on hospital support departments, and would those support departments be able to continue providing support if the focus was on the health crisis. So this included departments such as the clinical trials, pharmacy and medical imaging. We asked the researchers to think about how they could ensure adequate amounts of trial medication, what constitutes a protocol deviation, what was their process for reporting safety events, and was everyone in the team clear of those requirements. And our position in our office, which is the Ethics and Governance Oversight at CARS, was to encourage researchers to consider the specific details of their project and what action might be required in either the short or longer term. Next slide, thanks. Oh, thank you. Yeah, perfect. So talking about PPE use has taken up a lot of our time. So although it's not relevant to a large number of projects, we've had to ensure that their processes are appropriate for the use of personal protective equipment in our research appointments, particularly for the respiratory research projects. This has required adhering to the government guidelines, providing education to researchers around the appropriate use of equipment for their research appointments. And although this has only impacted a relatively small number of projects, it's taken up a lot of discussion, and it's included consideration of how to source the PPE, when to use it, who should be paying for it, is it really necessary, and how does using the PPE for research appointments impact access to the PPE for frontline healthcare workers. So as you will all have seen the horrific stories from overseas where there was a shortage of protective equipment for clinical care, it's understandable to us that researchers are focused on this issue, and we think that it helps to have clear guidelines, and we're fortunate that we have an experienced member of our team with a clinical background that can understand the implementation of the guidelines and support the researchers with this. So we actually have a dedicated clinical nurse manager who manages our research clinic, who's able to support researchers with their requirements around personal protective equipment for any research appointments. Next slide, thanks. Oh, thanks, next one. Great. So we're fortunate to have at CARS and particularly at Perth Children's Hospital a dedicated research outpatient clinic. Unfortunately, a large component of the clinical space in this area had to be repurposed at short notice. The repurposing was to ensure that there were adequate preparations in other areas of the hospital to manage any potential surge with emergency presentations due to the pandemic. We've been fortunate that this hasn't had a large impact on research projects to date because the overall use of our clinics has decreased because a number of our projects have had a reduction in or a pause to their recruitment processes, or they've moved to remote research contacts where possible. And as you could appreciate, relocating a hospital department is a significant undertaking. So at this stage, we'll continue with our research clinic with some reduced capacity, but we're continually contingency planning, and we were fortunate that we were able to conduct a very large project aimed at healthcare workers specific to the pandemic that recruited over 500 staff within a couple of weeks. And we were able to use another area within the hospital, which was an on-site family resource centre, which was currently not being open to the public. And it worked really well with the increased space. We were able to manage adequate social distancing and manage the flow of participants in a relatively short time frame that actually would have been quite difficult to manage in our outpatient clinic anyway. Next slide, thanks. So other factors to consider as we look now at scaling up activity again, and the new projects that were either planned or in the approval process from some months ago, we need to be continuing to assist those projects to get started or to make sure that their timeframes are appropriate. And there are a number of issues to consider, particularly things like the release of research funding. So a number of projects that are funded through grant funding, of course, it's caused a great deal of stress for the research teams to know if their project can begin and if they can continue to be employed in that research position. This risk to funding is directly related to job security, and we do acknowledge the impact that that's had on our interactions with researchers who have, on some instances, been feeling quite overwhelmed by the whole situation. So other issues include considering if there are changes that can be made to a protocol to make it more appropriate in the current climate, what aspects of the project can still continue remotely. So, for example, increasing the number of telephone or video conferencing appointments, the use of telehealth appointments, home visits if they're appropriate, and again, making any amendments to research protocols to ensure that data integrity is maintained. Next slide, thanks. So it's exciting for us to be part of a highly motivated team with our clinician researchers at CARS that are making amendments to their protocols to capture relevant data related to the pandemic, as well as being part of novel new COVID-19 related projects. We're taking part in some global research projects that are aimed at frontline healthcare workers, as well as some investigator-initiated projects that are looking at things like the impact of the pandemic on children, including the asymptomatic carriage of coronavirus in children. Thank you. So the next slide is really just links to our website. We found it really helpful to try and provide standardised advice on our website to guide researchers, particularly when they are working remotely. And we also link there to other resources such as the NHMRC guidance and the Australian Government position. And just the final slide, thank you. I'm sure all institutions have their own vision and values, but we found it really helpful to refer to ours at this time. Our vision and values guide us in our daily interactions with our colleagues and our healthcare service consumers. So we found it really helpful with the combination of being able to refer to good clinical practice in the national statement in regards to what to do with your research project, but also to refer to our values and to how we interact with each other and ensure that we are always showing support and respect and compassion to our colleagues who have all been struggling at such a challenging time. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks very much, Helen. Yeah, look, that's good, and I like the fact of bringing in your vision and your mission into this, because it puts into perspective what we're doing and why we're doing it, and then that then goes to the point of we've got to maintain the activities that we're doing as much as possible with those, you know, our clients, our patients' safety and our staff safety at heart. So thank you for that. So our next speaker is Lisa Eckstein. She's a senior lecturer in law at the University of Tasmania and chair of the Tasmanian Health and Medical Human Research Ethics Committee. Thank you, Lisa.
Okay, let me just check. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. I was having some audio issues at the start, so I'm now connected on my phone. I do apologise in advance if the connection drops out here. And yeah, I am, as mentioned, the chair of the Tasmanian Health and Medical Human Research Ethics Committee. As a little bit of context, we have just the one Health and Medical Ethics Committee in Tasmania, so we deal with all of the applications both for researchers at the University of Tasmania as well as the Tasmanian health system, which includes Hobart, Launceston and the Northwest, which many of you are aware was a site of the COVID-19 outbreak. We've certainly had an interesting time in the last several weeks. To put this in context, we had launched our online ethics review manager system 2 weeks before we went into shutdown, well not shutdown, but before we went into remote mode with COVID. So we were dealing with both getting used to a new online ethics review system and being remote from each other all at one time, which was in some ways a blessing. And I'll get to that in just a little. It's also probably worth pointing out that we aren't as advanced with our
Lisa, your sound, you're breaking up quite a lot. Are you on a handheld or a mobile?
A mobile.
Are you able to just change your position, maybe? No.
Okay. Let me see if I can go anywhere that might be better.
Just
yeah.
No.
Hello?
Can you
Okay.
close your window or something?
No, I don't. I've got the windows and doors closed. So I don't know what I can do. I'm sorry.
That might be a little bit better where you are now.
Okay, I'll keep it relatively brief. The main things that I wanted to raise are the mixed blessings that we have had through COVID. I would say that the most interesting transition we have had has been holding ethics committee meetings by Zoom. Previously, we had a relatively large group of ethics committee members in Hobart and other members video conferencing in from other parts of the state. And it had always been an imperfect system in that we were left with what was seen as the real committee in Hobart plus the admins in other parts of the state. Because we have been forced now to hold our meetings by Zoom, we've ended up with what I would consider to be a more inclusive meeting process than what we had previously. And we'll really need to be considering how we maintain some of that greater quality in our meetings with the better interaction that we can have in a face-to-face setting. And I think that is something we'll be thinking about as we move forward. As with many other ethics committees, we've also been working in this tight time frame. And so one thing that we have been doing a lot of that we always try to do but it has really forced our hand with is having a lot of phone calls and general correspondence with researchers to make sure that by the time that things get to committee, they are as well advanced as they can be to get things through as quickly as possible. And while that is something that we always strive to do, it has been a greater imperative given we have had several applications come through that are tricky, that aren't necessarily clear in terms of which risk pathway they should go down. And we've also had one or two applications that have tested our boundaries of research where we as a committee have needed to make sure that the research process is not going to be used for other kinds of goals. So that also has been an interesting process in positioning where we fit within the broader structures governing research and associated activities, both with the university and Tasmania. Yeah, I feel like I'll keep it there given my bad audio. But obviously happy to address anything later on.
All right, thanks, Lisa. Yes, no, the sound was a bit tricky. You could be understood, but it was a bit of a challenge. But I think your message came through clearly. So yeah, lots of issues to address and challenges to face there. So look, our final speaker today is Sonia Hancock. Sonia's the manager of the Research Integrity and Compliance in Queensland at the Metro South Health, and also an ARCS HREC and governance coordinator running our interest areas in that space. So we look forward to your presentation, Sonia. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me to talk about some of the what I call COVID Genies. So before I commence, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from which we meet and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. Now, my presentation will hopefully ignite discussion, which in turn may lead to enhanced service delivery to the research community. The coronavirus and certainly COVID-19 will forever leave a permanent dark cloud on humanity. A wise person once said that every dark cloud has a silver lining, and indeed, so does COVID. It presents itself via a few genies that have appeared out of the research administrative bottle. Those genies are going to be cast back into the bottle, should they? And if they shouldn't, how can we manage it so that it ends up leaving a positive stamp on ethics and governance processes in a continuing and post-pandemic era? Next slide, please.
Sonia, your audio is a bit scratchy as well. I'll just keep an eye on it to see if there's anything we can do to improve the good quality.
Okay, I'll try and speak a bit closer. Okay, so for the length of time I've been in research, can I just have the first bold appear? For the length of time I've been in research, whenever ethics and governance practices were discussed, the collective groan or bristling of the hairs on the back of people, often as a bureaucratic tick and flick exercise. The research administrator network were once painted with the same tarnished brush as the ATO, and there remains a plethora of literature that continues to paint that image. I've only put 3, but there's a lot more. So this particular tainted brush relates more specifically to clinical research as opposed to the clinical trials. So next, a little animation, please. Thank you. So this is now starting to change, and can I have the third animation, please? Thank you. As a customer service provider, research administrators are starting to reclaim the and they're now beginning to see the group paint our own picture. The background of legislation, policy and guidelines remain our foundation of practice. However, innovative thinking and a continuous improvement cycle is starting to appear, which in turn is addressing the gaps in service delivery. Next slide, please. Before I go into some of the specifics, I'd like you to introduce you to the Genies. Some of you may be quite familiar, and certainly we've heard a few of these in our previous few presentations. But whilst others are hopefully going to become newly acquainted with these Genies, the idea is that these Genies will in turn themselves into the new norm. So Genie A focuses specifically on research ethics and governance review. Genie B is a hybrid meeting model. Genie C is a risk-based approach with regards to research governance approval and authorisations. Genie D, oh my gosh, this one's a doozy, single agreement. And Genie E, my dear favourite, central support. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's start talking about the first 2 Genies, research ethics, governance review, and a hybrid meeting. And these specifically relate to HREC functioning. Some of the initial updating of service delivery has seen in how the HREC reviews applications. I'm sure that Queensland is not unique in developing strategies to support COVID research and doing so very quickly. Not only did we have the current research programs to support, but an additional wave of COVID-related research was arriving and fast. At the time, several committees across the state developed a rapid review pathway specifically for COVID research. A select few HREC representatives, including a chair and research governance officer, reviewed studies as soon as they arrived, which meant that the researcher had their further information request letter within days. The letter would not only include ethical considerations, but also research governance requirements. That was even before the SSA was submitted. This then prompted immediate contractual considerations as they applied, as well as the researchers being given the heads up on what would be required for an SSA. This rapid review pathway, I must note, was specifically enabled for the low and negligible risk studies. In addition, and more recently, we now have a panel of HREC members across the state who have volunteered to participate on a COVID-specific review pathway. This panel will be solely dedicated to review studies that are more than low risk, using a virtual digital review mechanism. To enable this, the HRECs from which the member originated from have amended their terms of reference to facilitate this statewide approach. It's all about working together to deliver. Another Genie that has popped up as the hybrid meeting Genie. For those committees who are less embracing technology to facilitate meeting conduct, the forced transition into the virtual world was met with enthusiasm, some more than others, but enthusiasm nevertheless. The time saving, particularly for the non-institutional members, is the highlight. But we really need to consider the loss of those corridor conversations or the sideline conversation during which networking, knowledge sharing, and even mentoring and collaboration often happens. That's not enabled through the virtual medium. perhaps we should consider a hybrid model to support HREC functions. Next slide, please. Changing gears slightly to research governance, specifically our third Genie explores risk-based assessment. So risk-based assessment research governance review has been lurking in the background for some time. It really hasn't had its place in lights like it should be. The level of rigour required to review an SSA submitted varies vastly and is dependent on the research project itself. As an example, a significant due diligence exercise would occur if a research team was proposing to conduct a phase 1 study combining a vaccine with an unapproved drug and the health service is asked to be a sponsor, versus the review required for an observational data collection study. These last 2 months have necessitated a risk-based approach to be front and centre and should be an adopted approach moving forward. Taking it one step further, if that same observational study is happening across multiple health services and the same research team can access the data across those sites, why would we ask researchers to submit multiple SSAs with ever so slight changes to the research team at each site? Could we not ask the identified lead RGO to conduct a full review and then make a recommendation across the participating HHSs for a light touch approach to governance review? This particular Genie comes with a bit of a bonus. The instant transition or removal of any paper documents as a result of staff having to work from home and remotely. Within Metro South, we were literally in the office 1 week and not the next, but we were still on deck. With no one in the office, we very quickly had to transfer to digital enablers to execute contracts and indemnities via digitally compliant processes, including PDF digital signatures and DocuSign. We are never looking back. Next slide, please. There is a little method to my madness here. This Genie looks rather befuddled by the concept of a single agreement. Let me explain. Within each of the jurisdictions, there are a growing number of templates that are used within each research network. The use of these legally pre-approved templates are fundamental in delivering mechanisms to support researchers in complying with the contractual arrangements. As a result of COVID, Queensland has had to take these templates and broaden their scope to outside of the initial research network by way of a third-party accession agreement. Now is the time to think broader. Could we make a single agreement work between a third party and multiple health services? What is stopping us from trying? And if it works, can you imagine the impact that this would have on contract management for a research team? For those of you who know me, I live in utopia. That's where I think this conversation should start. Whilst my head is in the clouds, I'm conscious of the implications that a single agreement across multiple health services or even crossing state borders would bring. However, if you limit your thinking in an era that is screaming for innovation and transformation, you're automatically limiting the value of innovative practices. I'd rather be an optimist proven wrong than a pessimist proven right. Next slide, please. Now, this Genie, as I said at the start, is probably my favourite and one that I wish was in place when I started in research some 20 years ago. All of a sudden, we had clinicians putting up their hands to participate in COVID-specific research who have never been through the submission process and could not tell you the difference between a HREC and an SSA. With the terrific support of the Health Innovation Investment Research Office within Queensland's Department of Health, project officers with direct experience were immediately deployed to act as the central HREC/SSA submission specialist who coordinated submission requirements across the multiple health services involved in the project on behalf of the researcher. Within 7 business days, not only was the HREC and SSA submitted, but research governance authorisation was granted for an observational study that was ethically approved across the state. It only took 7 business days because we didn't realise what we could do. Needless to say, the clinician was gracious in his praise. It's this level of support that we are fundamentally missing in transitioning clinicians into clinical researchers. And my last slide, please. I'd like to finish by saying, yes, I may be overly enthusiastic, but the opportunities that are continuing to present themselves are too important for the research community to not harness and implement as business as COVID. does it really take a pandemic to reset and deliver a customer service model that has the researcher at its core? This is where we as leaders and change agents need to support the research community through the chaos. By facilitating change through enabling the collective to be courageous in trying new approaches, the old tarnished brush of research ethics and governance as being a disabler will disappear. Whilst research administration within Australia may not come up with the cure for COVID, it has the potential to throw open the doors and lay down the royal rug to enable the regulatory pathway for a cure. Thank you for listening. I can only hope my presentation has sparked an idea for exploration and progression.
Oh, Sonia, love it. Just love it. Look, thanks. I'm the Genie lives on his back. Genie loves chimney stacks. He's outrageous. Balls. Genie, let yourself go. You did. You let yourself go. That was fantastic. No, I thought that was really terrific. And I too, whilst we're in the process of a major disruption with COVID, where you get disruption, you get innovation, and I think that's what we're seeing and what we've got to then embed in the way we do things going forward. So I'm all for that. So look, we're at a point to go to questions. So I'll hand over to Sue Mason, who's going to run with the questions. Thank you, Sue.
Thanks, Shani. I have a question here for Helen. Can you comment on the Regulatory Ethics Committee receptivity towards virtual or hybrid trials post-COVID-19, including e-consent, remote monitoring, e-source home nursing, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of things that we do already anyway. So we do have a process for remote consent. We've certainly been encouraging people always to take consent in the way most appropriate to their project. You know, as was just presented, I think this gives us the opportunity to look at all our processes and see what we can do better, how we can streamline things and how we can make things at their most basic, I guess, more acceptable to participants, but also to researchers to expedite the processes that we have in place for review and approval.
Thanks, Helen. I have a question for Sonia. Has a rapid review process described by yourself opened the possibility of single state HREC rather than committees at multiple organisations? Has it broken down egos, need for local HREC input?
That's a loaded question. I think it certainly has shown that anything is a possibility if the conditions are right. I completely agree. There is this sort of silo effect, which is probably inhibiting, you know, getting studies off the ground. But different states obviously have very different structures in terms of the health service entities and the Department of Health. So, you know, back in 2012, sorry, we all became our own independent HHSs. Now, that was for a reason. So, yes, the door has been flung open. The courageous amongst us will traipse through it and see what we can find, but that is a long road ahead.
Thanks, Sonia. Another question for you, Sonia, is the submission specialist, it's been suggested is a brilliant idea, but what is the increased cost or charge associated with that?
Okay, so when you're considering a submission specialist, you need to identify the scope of practice in terms of which research groups you will look at enabling. So across any health service or academic research partner, you will have multiple experiences and multiple mechanisms of tapping into that network, collective network, if you like. I'm not suggesting, although one option would be to have a single resource available across a particular network, But that's not the only way forward. I think tapping into the collective expertise and reaching out through that sort of volunteer mentality to assist others who are not fortunate to have the infrastructure in place to get the researchers up and running. Those are the sorts of models that would be considered, because you couldn't ask a department to, you know, put up an AO6, which is probably about 100,000 Ks a year for demonstrating a significant value add. So there's multiple ways of peeling the orange on this one, but certainly someone who knows, and what I call a research electrician, that you can plug people, the right people together, that's what's screaming out as missing.
Thanks, Sonia. Another question or for your thoughts on, should we perhaps consider simplifying the SSA process to only that which is vital?
Oh, yes, that's an absolute yes. I think we have to come back to the reasons why we are asking for things. Why do we, as a research governance, and this could be quite controversial, but I'm open to a discussion, why we as research governance officers require researchers' CVs when the HREC approving the study have already vetoed them. Why do we ask for what we ask for? I think we need to really collectively review that and look at minimum requirements, because the significant administrative burden on researchers for submitting the same thing across multiple jurisdictions is a research effort gone to waste, and we need to rein that back in.
Thanks, Sonia. There's just someone else who would like to add to the blue sky thinking and suggest that we include thinking about how the community can also be part of the solution and remodelling in research processes.
Absolutely. You know, in Queensland at this point in time, we're actually undertaking a business redesign project. We've had to sort of temporarily put it on hold with regards to COVID, but moving forward, we're looking at engaging all and sundry, including, you know, research administrators, researchers, HREC members, chairs, executives, across the whole network to really rethink what we do and why we do it. And including in that conversation should be, and absolutely will be at the table, are patients, the people who are on the receiving end of all of this. You know, do they really want to read a 24-page PICF? Guaranteed the answer is no. So how else can we facilitate informed consent? These are the sorts of discussions that have to start happening and have to be enabled in order for us to get to a place where we're actually delivering a high quality service output. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you, Sonia. There is a question for Lisa, but I'm not sure how good her audio will be. But there's a question that you mentioned that virtual meetings made the meetings more balanced. What were the key issues that made you say that?
Sorry, the key issues that made me say what?
That the virtual meetings that you held were more balanced.
Oh, so we were in a position where we had 3/4 of our members in one location, which was in Hobart, and 1/4 of our HREC members scattered across other sites around Tasmania. What this meant is that the conversations at the meetings would largely be around the people in Hobart, and for those members trying to participate by video conference, there was always a barrier to their participation. What COVID and the Zoom meetings has allowed us is it equalised the playing field among members. Now, obviously there are trade-offs to that. There's trade-offs to not being able to meet in person, but the equalising the playing field so that those members not in Hobart feel as integral a part of the committee as those in Hobart has been a really important lesson for us as a committee.
Thank you for that, Lisa. I don't have any other questions, Shani, but someone just put a statement up that says, as Frank Underwood would say, if you don't like the way the table is set, turn over the table.
Yeah.
Yeah, look,
I'd
great,
be happy to push the table over on that one.
I don't think you get any disagreements here, but look, this has been, I think, a very good and challenging panel discussion today, and I think it has. I guess it's starting to ask a lot of those questions of why we've done, and I know why we've got to where we've gotten, but I think this pandemic is providing us an opportunity to reset the way we do things and rethink the reality of what we do and why we do it, and you know, some of the things are repetitious because that's just the way we've done them, and we're not going to take it out from one area to put it into another because we don't want to. But look, great presentations. Thank you so much to our speakers today, to Suzanne filling in from last week, Helen, Lisa and Sonia. Thank you so much for your time. Also, thank you to our the sponsors for this session, MTP Connect and New South Wales Health. We love that support, and with the volunteer program to New South Wales and to Queensland. Thank you for that as well. Now next week, if we put that slide up, we have part 9, and this one I'm really looking forward to as well. This is going to be, we're going to be hearing from some vaccine specialists about what's happening in the world of a cure in the form of a vaccine for COVID-19, and I'd love you to also join me at that session next week. So thank you, everybody. Have a great week. Thanks, everybody. That was really terrific.
Thanks, Shani. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.